it is debatable whether an extraordinary session of the African Union Assembly was warranted to discuss the relationship between Africa and the International Criminal Court. However, he feels that if robust debate were to be framed appropriately and directed towards rectifying various problems in the ICC, making it more just and effective, it would be of a huge service, not only to Africa's quest to end impunity, but also for the international legal order in general. Joining me in studio for more is Sivu Makongo. He's a senior research consultant in the Transnational Threats and International Crime Division of the Institute of Security Studies. Sivu, thank you so much for making the time to chat to us on Beyond Markets. If we look at the core issue here, is the AU's call for a postponement of Kenyatta and Ruto's case significant enough to alter the relationship between the African Union and the ICC?
Not really, because within the ICC statute itself, it was provided that should an event warrant that a case that is before the ICC should be postponed, should be deferred, that should be submitted to the United Nations Security Council, and the United Nations Security Council, within its purview, looking at the security imperatives, can then make a decision as to whether to defer or not. So what the African Union is asking for in respect of a deferral and the process they're proposing for a deferral is consistent with what is contained already in the International Criminal Court statute.
But what should we expect from the United Nations Security Council? Is it likely that they might support a call for a deferral based on the fact that these are a sitting head of state?
Well, they will not consider it on the basis that these are sitting heads of state. In fact, that will not be a consideration whatsoever. The consideration on which they will make it will be security imperatives. And in this case, specifically with regard to Kenya, you will know that on the 21st of September, Kenya suffered a terrible terrorist attack in the Westgate Mall. Now, that will probably be one of the considerations that they will make, because Kenya now becomes part of the frontier against the fight on terrorism, which specific countries who are members of the Security Council, and these countries, I will imagine, will be the US and Britain, who will now be sympathetic towards the Kenyan cause in light of the attack that occurred in Kenya.
But isn't that manipulating the situation a little bit, Sivu? Because to a large extent, Kenyatta and Ruto have been called before the ICC, not so much based on the recent attack we saw at Westgate Mall, but for much earlier crimes against humanity that they've allegedly played a significant role in ensuring that they happened. And now to put this terrorist attack at the forefront and say this is the reason why they cannot stand in the dock seems a little bit mischievous.
Well, it is a fact that the terrorist attack did occur. And I imagine had the deferral been requested absent this terrorist attack, then there will be no security imperatives to warrant any deferral. But the fact that the terrorist did occur, it does change the game. And so we may view it one way or the other, but the fact is the terrorist attack did occur, and it's now in the interest of either the United Nations Security Council or Kenya itself to make this fact available to the United Nations Security Council for it to make a decision as to whether does this warrant, therefore, a deferral for those leaders to be able to focus on the fight against terrorism.
Of course, a lot of the arguments has also been around ensuring that there's a process of reconciliation that happens in countries where we've seen civil strife before persecution. Do you support this argument?
Well, I do. I think there are various forms of justice. There's the justice that you will have in the court. There's what we call as well transitional justice, which is Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. However, where Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are simply set up in order to shield people from accountability, then of course they become a farce. But where it is a process of a truth-telling, where people are held accountable for their acts, then of course it's a process of healing, because justice in itself is in fact aimed at making sure that there's healing amongst the parties. Because when a party is victimized and doesn't have any way of demonstrating that I was victimized, any way of saying I was victimized by so-and-so, then you have a problem of continued victimization. But what justice does, and even transitional justice does, it puts an end to victimization, because then you can have a cathartic process. And so, yes, we support Truth and Reconciliation Commissions.
Do you also then support the argument that now questions the credibility of the ICC, going as far as saying that these acts are racial stereotyping and a clear targeting of African leaders? Or is this perhaps taking it a bit far?
No, we don't support that whatsoever. In fact, that is a mischievous argument, because the argument that is being made is simply this. Because the International Criminal Court does not have before itself cases regarding crimes that may have been committed in Iraq or crimes that may have been committed in Afghanistan, and suggesting that those crimes could possibly have been committed by either former President Bush or former Prime Minister Blair, because it doesn't have those crimes, then it's being viewed as racist. But the fact of the matter is this. Crimes did occur in Kenya. Crimes did occur in Sudan. And so the International Criminal Court is in fact looking at crimes that did occur. In respect of these countries where you have President Bush, former President Bush and Prime Minister Blair, in respect of them where they're unable to prosecute those, it is simply because of the Security Council that is not able to refer those cases to the International Criminal Court. And so really the changes have to be done in terms of reforming the Security Council, so that wherever crimes occur, the ICC can be able to be seized of those crimes. The power which those countries have to be able to commit crimes in countries such as Iraq or countries such as Afghanistan, if that power gives them license to do so without accountability, it does not mean that African leaders should be granted the same license, because only Africans will suffer from such a license.
So going back to the question, whose interests do you think were served at that extraordinary summit?
Well, that extraordinary summit looked at the prosecution against leaders. So the interests that were being served were leaders. It should have been looking as well as what justice should be there for victims. And that's why the International Criminal Court was set up. It was not set up to prosecute leaders. It was set up to provide justice for victims. And that's what they should be looking at. And the victims are usually, in this case that we're looking at, are Africans.
So it seems as if the biggest reforms are actually needed within the African Union more than they needed in the ICC in this particular case. Because if we're saying that it is the people of Africa that are standing to lose the most from these from the summit and this extraordinary summit, this summit was called by African leaders, so they are the ones shortchanging Africans more than the ICC?
That's precisely the case. But in terms of written reforms themselves, within the African Union, the reforms have been made. You will recall that there used to be an Organization of African Unity. The Organization of African Unity didn't allow whatsoever from any sort of intervention in cases of war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. But when they reformed the Organization of African Unity to the Organization of African Union, one of the principles that they highlighted in the Constitutive Act establishing the African Union was that they will no longer stand by when crimes against humanity are committed, genocide is committed, or war crimes. Now they just need to live up to that principle. But with this specific summit, it didn't seem that they were looking at living up to that principle.